My name is Max. I am 35 years old, and I never thought my own family would try to destroy everything I worked for. 5 years ago, I bought my first rental property after saving every penny I earned. Now I own 3 houses in a nice suburban area where I pride myself on being a fair landlord. Until last month, when I discovered my parents had visited my tenants behind my back and told them they were being exploited and should stop paying rent. Then my brother Daniel showed up claiming he was the new landlord. Before I dive into this nightmare, let me know where you are watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe to follow my journey through this family betrayal. My path to property ownership was not an easy one. Unlike some investors who inherited wealth or had family support, I built everything from scratch. Throughout my 20s, I juggled 3 jobs simultaneously. Weekdays, I worked at an accounting firm, evenings at a local restaurant, and weekends doing landscaping gigs. Every dollar that did not go toward basic living expenses went straight into my savings account. This meant no vacations for 8 years straight. My wardrobe consisted of the same 5 shirts and 3 pairs of pants rotated throughout the week. My apartment was a tiny studio in the least desirable part of town, with noisy neighbors and unreliable heating. The car I drove was a 15-year-old Honda with over 200,000 miles on it, held together by determination and prayer. When friends invited me out, I became known as the guy who always ordered water and the cheapest item on the menu. By 30, I had saved enough for a down payment on my first property. I still remember the day I got the keys. A small, 3-bedroom ranch-style house that needed significant work but had good bones. I spent every evening and weekend for 6 months, renovating it myself, learning plumbing, electrical work, and carpentry from YouTube videos and library books. My hands were perpetually rough and cut up, but I felt an immense pride watching that house transform. When it came time to find tenants, I researched fair market rates in the area and deliberately set my rent about 10% below average. I wanted good, stable tenants who would stay long-term, and I believed treating people fairly was both morally right and good business. After the success of the first house, I continued working and saving, adding a second property 2 years later and a third one just last year. My approach to being a landlord has always been straightforward. I maintain the properties well, respond to repair requests promptly, and have never raised rent on existing tenants more than 3% annually, even when the market would have supported much larger increases. I learn the names of my tenants' children, remember their birthdays with small gift cards, and bring holiday cookies each December. These were not just business relationships to me. They were connections with real people who deserved respect. Unfortunately, my family never supported my real estate endeavors. My parents, Richard and Margaret, were university professors with strongly held socialist beliefs. In their worldview, private property, especially rental property, was inherently exploitative. They raised me on stories about tenant organizing and rent strikes from the 1970s when they were active in housing protests during their college years. While they tolerated my accounting career, they viewed my transition to property ownership as a moral failing. At family gatherings, my father would make pointed comments about landlords being parasites, while my mother would sigh dramatically and ask when I would do something meaningful with my life, like teaching or social work. My brother Daniel, 3 years younger than me, fully embraced our parents' worldview, but none of their work ethic. At 32, he still lived in their basement, cycling through a series of part-time jobs that never lasted more than a few months. He fancied himself a revolutionary artist, though his artistic output seemed limited to angry social media posts and the occasional protest sign. He referred to my properties as my capitalist empire, and to me as the family sellout. Last Thanksgiving provided a preview of what was to come. During dinner, my father asked about my newest property in a tone that initially seemed like genuine interest. When I mentioned installing new energy-efficient windows for my tenants, Daniel snorted and said, "Those are not your tenants. They are people you are extorting for shelter." My mother nodded approvingly, while adding, "Housing should be a human right, not a way for people to profit." I tried explaining that I provided well-maintained homes at below-market rates, but they were not interested in nuance. The conversation devolved into a lecture about how I was part of a system that kept people oppressed. I left dinner early that night feeling a familiar mix of disappointment and frustration. Still, I never imagined they would actively interfere with my business. That would cross a line from ideological disagreement to deliberate sabotage, and surely they would not go that far. The tenants in my properties were mostly working families. At the first house, Rachel and Tom lived with their 2 elementary school-aged children. Tom worked in construction while Rachel was a nurse at the local hospital. They had been my tenants for 4 years, almost since the beginning, and we had always had a friendly, respectful relationship. The second property housed a retired couple, Martha and George, in the main unit, while a young web developer named Justin rented the converted garage apartment. Martha and George lived on a fixed income, which was why I had been particularly careful to keep their rent increases minimal, knowing they budgeted to the penny. My newest property was rented by 3 roommates in their late 20s, Jeff, Lisa, and Megan, all teachers at the same middle school. They appreciated the 3-bedroom layout that gave each of them private space while keeping their housing costs affordable on educator salaries. All of these tenants had my personal cell phone number and knew they could call any time with concerns. I made a point of walking through each property every 6 months, not just to check for maintenance issues, but to ask how they were doing and if there were improvements they wanted to see. Just last quarter, I had installed ceiling fans in all bedrooms at the 3rd property after the roommates mentioned summer heat making sleep difficult. This system worked well for everyone. My tenants had secure, well-maintained housing at reasonable rates. I made enough profit to cover mortgages, taxes, insurance, and maintenance, with some left over to reinvest and slowly build wealth. It seemed like a fair arrangement that benefited all parties while I provided a valuable service. At least that was what I believed, until the phone call that changed everything. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning. I was at my day job reviewing quarterly tax filings when my phone rang. Seeing Rachel's name on the screen was unusual. She typically texted rather than called, and never during work hours. I stepped into the hallway to answer. "Hello, Rachel. Everything okay at the house?" There was an awkward pause before she replied, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Hi, Max. I wanted to talk to you about something. Your parents came by yesterday." My parents? I felt an immediate knot in my stomach. What do you mean they came by? Rachel sounded uncomfortable. "They introduced themselves as your parents. Said they wanted to inspect the property. I would not have let them in, but they had photos of you together on their phone, so I knew they really were your family." My mind raced, trying to make sense of this. They just showed up. What did they want? "Well, that is the thing," Rachel continued, her voice dropping lower. "They told us we did not have to pay rent anymore. That you were." She paused, as if reluctant to repeat their words. "That you were exploiting us and charging too much. They said as your parents, they were ashamed of your business practices and wanted to make things right." I felt like I had been punched. Did they leave anything or take anything? What exactly did they say? Rachel sighed. "They left some papers about tenant rights and rent control. They talked a lot about housing justice and said we should organize with your other properties." I did not really know what to say to them, Max. It was pretty awkward. I apologized profusely to Rachel, assured her my parents had no authority over my properties, and promised to address the situation immediately. After hanging up, I sat in my car for several minutes trying to process what had happened. My own parents had gone behind my back to undermine my business and relationships with tenants. The betrayal cut deep. That afternoon, I drove to the property to assess the damage firsthand. Rachel met me at the door with an expression that mixed sympathy with unease. Inside, her husband, Tom, sat stiffly at the kitchen table, none of his usual friendly banter forthcoming. "Can I see what they left?" I asked. Rachel silently handed me a stack of papers. There were printouts about tenant rights information on rent control laws that did not even apply in our state, and, most disturbingly, a handwritten note from my mother encouraging them to withhold rent and form a tenant union with my other properties. She had included contact information for all my other tenants, a serious violation of privacy. "When did they come exactly?" I asked, still trying to piece together what happened. "Around 4 yesterday," Tom answered, speaking for the first time. "Your dad did most of the talking, called you a housing parasite, said you were part of the problem with this country, said we were paying your mortgage and making you rich while working people suffer." Rachel and I just stood there, not knowing what to say. Rachel jumped in, looking uncomfortable. "We did not agree with them, Max. We know you have been fair with us. But they said they raised you better than this, and seemed really disappointed in you. It was strange. I left their house with a cold feeling spreading through my chest. My next stop was the second property, where I found a similar situation. Martha and George seemed genuinely confused about where their rent payments should go now. Justin, typically easygoing, asked pointed questions about whether I was really charging below market rate or if that was just something I told myself. The third property was worst of all. Jeff, one of the teacher roommates, had apparently found my parents' message particularly resonant. He greeted me with crossed arms and a hostile expression. "We have been discussing what your parents said," he informed me, gesturing toward Lisa and Megan, who looked less certain. "We think a 20% rent reduction would be more in line with actual fair market value, considering the inequality in the housing system." I spent nearly 3 hours at that property, pulling up actual rental listings to demonstrate that their rent was already well below market, explaining my mortgage and tax obligations, and trying to rebuild the trust that my parents had, shattered in a single visit. By the time I left, Lisa and Megan seemed somewhat reassured, but Jeff remained skeptical, clearly viewing me through the new lens my parents had provided. That evening, I attempted to contact my parents. My calls went straight to voicemail. I sent texts asking for an explanation, which my mother eventually responded to with a brief message. "We are simply telling people the truth about what you are doing. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps examine why." My father followed up with an email that read, in part, "The housing market is immoral, and your participation in it perpetuates injustice. As your parents, we cannot stand by while you profit from a basic human need. We have always taught you about social responsibility, and this intervention was necessary since you have clearly forgotten those lessons." I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the looks on my tenants' faces, a mixture of confusion, suspicion, and in some cases the gleam of opportunity. Property ownership had always been my path to financial security, the result of tremendous sacrifice and work. Now my own family was actively trying to destroy it, treating me like I was exploiting people when I had gone out of my way to be fair and responsible. The next morning, I called my attorney to discuss what had happened and understand my legal options. She advised documenting everything and sending formal notices to my tenants, reaffirming our lease agreements. She also suggested sending cease and desist letters to my parents, though she acknowledged that family matters complicated the usual legal remedies. What I did not realize then was that this first betrayal was just the beginning. My parents were not finished, and my brother was about to enter the picture in a way that would escalate the situation beyond anything I could have imagined. A week after discovering my parents' initial interference, I decided to address the situation head-on with all my tenants. I organized a Saturday morning meeting at my first property, inviting everyone from all 3 houses. I prepared a presentation showing the actual market rates for comparable rentals, my history of below-average rent increases, and documentation of all the property improvements I had made at my own expense. When the tenants arrived, I sensed an immediate shift in the atmosphere. People who had previously been warm and friendly now sat with guarded expressions. Rachel and Tom made small talk, but seemed uncomfortable. Martha and George sat quietly in the corner, their usual cheerfulness noticeably absent. The 3 teacher roommates arrived last, with Jeff immediately taking a seat at the front, with a notebook, as if preparing to document evidence against me. I began by acknowledging the awkward situation. "I know my parents visited you all last week and shared some opinions about me and our rental arrangements. I want to address any concerns directly and transparently." Before I could continue, Jeff interrupted. "Your parents said you are making a 40% profit margin on these properties. Is that true?" I tried to explain the financial reality, how property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and mortgage interest meant my actual profit margin was much lower, but Jeff had clearly made up his mind. Each explanation I offered was met with skepticism. "So you admit you are profiting off our need for housing?" Jeff pressed, while Lisa and Megan exchanged uncomfortable glances behind him. Even Rachel, my longest tenant, asked, "If you are charging below market rate like you say, why not show us your mortgage statements to prove it?" The question stunned me. After 4 years of prompt maintenance and reasonable rent, I was suddenly being asked to prove I was not exploiting them. The trust had evaporated overnight. By the end of the meeting, I had managed to partially reassure most of the tenants, but the damage was done. The warm community feeling I had worked hard to foster had been replaced with an adversarial dynamic. The following month brought the first financial impact. When rent came due, Justin and two of the teachers, Jeff and Lisa, did not pay. They each sent messages citing different reasons: a temporary cash flow issue, an unexpected car repair, and in Jeff's case, a straightforward statement that he was withholding rent until we negotiated a more equitable arrangement. With 3 out of 8 tenants not paying, I was suddenly short over $3,000 that I needed for mortgage payments. I dipped into my emergency fund, hoping this was a temporary problem that could be resolved quickly. But the situation only worsened. 2 weeks after my tenant meeting, Rachel called again, this time sounding genuinely apologetic. "Your parents came back, Max. They brought someone they said was a tenant advocate. They walked around taking pictures of stuff they said were code violations. That small crack in the bathroom tile. They said it was a health hazard. The advocate person gave us forms to file complaints with the housing authority." I drove over immediately and found my second property had received a similar visit. Martha was in tears, saying she felt caught in the middle of a family dispute. "They said we should be paying half what you charge us. That you are taking advantage of seniors," she said, her voice shaking. "George and I have always thought you were a good landlord. We do not want to move at our age." The situation escalated further when I discovered my parents had taken their campaign public. They had joined several local Facebook community groups and were sharing their story about their son, the exploitative landlord who needed to be held accountable. They posted selectively cropped photos of minor maintenance issues, presenting them as major problems I was ignoring. They shared information about my properties and encouraged community members to drive by and show support for the tenants. The posts were gaining traction. People who had never met me or seen my properties were commenting about greedy landlords and the housing crisis. Someone even created a hashtag #MaxTheExploiter that was being shared in our local community. My reputation was being systematically dismantled by the two people who should have been most supportive of my success. The social media campaign soon spilled over into my professional life. I worked at a mid-sized accounting firm where community relationships were important. Several colleagues cautiously approached me to ask about the posts they had seen. One client even called our office manager to express concern about working with someone accused of being a slumlord. My boss called me into her office to discuss the situation. While she was understanding, she also made it clear that any negative publicity could impact the firm. I found myself having to defend my personal business practices in my professional workspace, watching as the life I had carefully built began cracking from multiple directions. By the second month, 5 of my 8 tenants were not paying full rent. Some paid partial amounts, others nothing at all. My emergency fund was dwindling rapidly. While the mortgage companies were uninterested in my family drama, they simply wanted their monthly payments. I consulted with my attorney again this time about beginning the eviction process for non-paying tenants. She outlined the procedure but warned me it would be costly and time-consuming, potentially taking months to resolve, especially if tenants claimed habitability issues or retaliation. The advocate my parents had introduced was likely coaching them on how to extend the process as long as possible. The financial stress was crushing. I had always been careful with money, maintaining excellent credit and never missing payments. Now I was facing the possibility of late mortgage payments, which would damage my credit score and potentially put me at risk of foreclosure if the situation continued long-term. What I did not know then was that the worst was yet to come. While I was struggling to manage the fallout from my parents' interference, my brother was preparing to take their sabotage to an entirely new level. The situation reached its breaking point on a rainy Thursday afternoon in April. I had scheduled a visit to my second property to fix a leaking faucet that Martha had reported the previous day. Given everything that had happened, I was being extra responsive to maintenance requests, hoping to rebuild some goodwill with my tenants. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar truck parked in front. When I approached the house, I heard male voices inside the kitchen, where I found my brother Daniel directing 2 of his friends who were carrying boxes through the front door. Martha stood in the corner looking confused and distressed. "What is going on here?" I demanded, blocking the doorway, as another of Daniel's friends attempted to bring in what appeared to be a mattress. Daniel turned with a smirk that made my blood boil. Well, if it is not the capitalist exploiter himself, I am moving in. Mom and Dad transferred ownership to me, since you clearly cannot be trusted with the responsibility. Martha stepped forward, wringing her hands. He says he is the new landlord, Max. He told us we can stay, but we should pay him instead at a reduced rate. We did not know what to do. Daniel pulled out a folder and waved a document in my face. It is all legal. Mom and Dad signed over their interest in the property to me. I am going to run it the right way as affordable housing, not a profit center for the bourgeoisie. I snatched the paper from his hand and quickly scanned it. It was a crudely created document with my parents' signatures purporting to transfer ownership of my property to Daniel. It was complete nonsense legally. My parents had no ownership interest to transfer, but it looked official enough to confuse my already anxious tenants. This is fraud, I said, my voice shaking with anger. You have no right to be here. This is my property. I have the deed and mortgage in my name. Daniel stepped closer, using his slight height advantage to loom over me. The property belongs to whoever occupies it, man. That is the new way of thinking. I am occupying the master bedroom as the new building manager. I will be collecting a small maintenance fee from the tenants, just enough to cover costs, not to get rich like you. I turned to Martha and George. This is completely false. They cannot transfer ownership like this. I am still your landlord, and your lease with me is still valid. George nodded uncertainly, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Your brother said your parents are the actual owners, and you were just the front man, that they provided the down payment. That is a lie, I said firmly. I bought this property entirely with my own money. My parents have never contributed a penny to any of my properties. Daniel laughed. That is not how they tell it, bro. They say they supported you for years while you saved up. That makes it family money, not just yours. I asked Martha and George to give us a moment and stepped outside with Daniel, hoping to reason with him privately. Once we were alone, his demeanor changed from performative revolutionary to straightforward intimidation. Listen up, he growled, jabbing a finger into my chest. Mom and Dad want these properties run properly. They have given me the authority to take over. You can fight it and make a big scene, embarrass the whole family, or you can step aside and let me handle things from now on. When I refused making it clear, I would be calling the police. Daniel's expression darkened. You always thought you were better than me, with your respectable job and your property empire. But you are just a parasite, man. At least I am honest about who I am. I did call the police, but when they arrived, they were frustratingly unhelpful. After looking at both Daniel's fraudulent transfer document and my actual property deed, they declared it a civil matter that would need to be resolved in court. Since Daniel had been let into the property by the tenants who were confused about the ownership situation, the officers said they could not remove him as a trespasser. As the police left without taking action, Daniel gave me a triumphant smile and returned to directing his friends, who were now installing a new deadbolt on the master bedroom door. I watched in horror as he effectively took possession of part of my property, while I stood by apparently powerless to stop him. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation deteriorated further. Daniel not only established himself in my second property, but began visiting the other properties as well, introducing himself as the new owner and instructing tenants to direct reduced rent payments to him. He provided his Venmo and Cash App information and told them any payments made to me would not be recognized. At my third property, he went so far as to begin clearing out a storage room, claiming he would be opening a community space for tenant organizing. Jeff, already primed against me by my parents, became Daniel's enthusiastic supporter, helping to spread the word about the change in management. My attorney advised filing for an emergency injunction and preparing for a court battle, but warned the process would take time and money, both of which were in increasingly short supply, as my rental income had now almost completely dried up. 3 months had passed since my parents' first visit, and I had received less than 40% of the expected rent during that period. The financial reality was becoming dire. I had depleted my emergency fund entirely. My primary checking account was nearly empty. I had missed one mortgage payment already, and was about to miss a second. The mortgage companies were sending threatening letters, and my previously excellent credit score had dropped over 100 points. For the first time, I faced the very real possibility of losing everything I had worked for. If the properties went into foreclosure, not only would I lose my investments and damage my financial future, but my tenants would also be displaced, regardless of who they were currently paying or thought owned the buildings. The emotional toll was equally severe. I had barely slept in weeks, existing on coffee and anxiety. I had stopped answering calls from unknown numbers, fearing they were from bill collectors or angry neighbors who had seen my parents' social media posts. I had canceled social plans and withdrawn from friends unable to explain the bizarre family drama that had engulfed my life. One evening after another, frustrating an unsuccessful attempt to reason with Daniel by phone, I sat alone in my car in an empty parking lot and finally broke down. Years of sacrifice, thousands of hours of hard work, all my careful planning and fair dealing had been undermined by my own family in a matter of months. The injustice of it crushed me with a weight that felt physical. For a brief, dark moment, I considered giving up. Maybe I could just walk away. Let the banks take the properties, move to another state, and start over. The thought of continuing to fight my own family, of having to legally battle my parents and brother, felt too painful to bear. I called my oldest friend Alex, the only person who truly understood my history with my family and what these properties meant to me. After listening to my despair, he asked a simple question that changed everything. If you give up now, will you ever forgive yourself? The question cut through my exhaustion and despair. I knew the answer immediately. No, I would not forgive myself. This was not just about money or property. It was about standing up for myself, for the truth, and for the right to build a life on my own terms, even if that life looked different from what my family wanted for me. In that parking lot, tear-streaked and exhausted, I made a decision. I would not surrender what I had built. I would fight back strategically, intelligently, and within the law. My family had chosen to declare war on my livelihood. I had not wanted this battle, but I would absolutely finish it. The morning after my breakdown in the parking lot, I woke with a clarity I had not felt in months. My first step was finding a better attorney, someone with specific expertise in property disputes and family conflicts. My regular attorney was competent for routine matters, but had seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of my situation. Through a real estate investors group online, I found Catherine Walsh, a property attorney with 30 years of experience, who specialized in difficult landlord-tenant cases. Her consultation fee was steep, but within 10 minutes of explaining my situation, I knew she was worth every penny. This is an unusual case, but not as uncommon as you might think, Catherine said after listening to my full story. Family property disputes can be particularly messy. The good news is that the law is unambiguously on your side. The bad news is that resolving this will require a multi-pronged approach. Together, we developed a comprehensive strategy. The first priority was documenting everything thoroughly. I created detailed timelines of every interaction with my parents and brother, collected all written communications, and recorded phone conversations where legally permitted. I photographed the changes Daniel had made to my properties, including the new locks and removed belongings. Catherine helped me understand the specific laws that were being violated, from trespassing and fraud to tortious interference with business relationships. She explained that while my emotional focus was understandably on my family's betrayal, the legal focus needed to be on the concrete damages and violations. For each property, we compiled the complete ownership documentation, deed mortgage, property tax records, and insurance policies, all clearly showing me as the sole owner. We also gathered all tenant leases, rent payment histories, and maintenance records to demonstrate I had been a responsible and responsive landlord. With this documentation in hand, Catherine drafted cease and desist letters to both my parents and Daniel. The letters outlined the specific laws they were violating and the potential legal consequences, including financial damages and potential criminal charges for fraud. We had them delivered by courier service that required signature confirmation. For the properties where Daniel had established a physical presence, we filed for emergency injunctions to remove him and restore my access. For tenants who had withheld rent, we began the formal eviction process, making sure to follow every procedural requirement perfectly so there could be no legal delays based on technicalities. Catherine also advised filing a police report for fraud regarding the fake ownership transfer document Daniel had created. The police had initially treated the situation as a civil matter, but the creation of fraudulent legal documents was potentially criminal. Having an official police report would strengthen our case in civil court and might eventually lead to criminal charges if necessary. While the legal process moved forward, I began a parallel effort to reclaim control of the narrative and rebuild relationships with my tenants. I created a professional-looking information packet for each tenant that included a clear explanation of the situation presented factually without emotional language, copies of official ownership documents proving I was the legitimate owner, a breakdown of property expenses versus rental income showing my actual profit. Margins were reasonable. Documentation of all improvements and repairs made over their tenancy. Comparison charts showing my rents were below market rate. Information about the potential consequences of the current situation, including the risk of foreclosure and forced eviction if mortgage payments continued to be missed. Rather than sending these packets by mail, where they might be intercepted or ignored, I scheduled individual meetings with each tenant. Some were reluctant to meet, but I persisted offering to meet in public places where they would feel comfortable. These conversations were difficult but essential. With Rachel and Tom, my longest tenants, I appealed to our 4-year history of good relations. I know my parents have put you in an awkward position, I told them, but you have known me for years. Have I ever given you reason to distrust me before this? With Martha and George, I emphasized the stability they needed at their age. Do you really want to put your housing at risk based on my brother's claims? He has never held a steady job or owned property. Do you trust him to maintain this house properly if something breaks? Even with Jeff, the most hostile tenant, I tried to find common ground. I understand believing housing should be more affordable. I agree the system has problems. But destroying my properties does not fix the system, it just hurts both of us. If I lose these houses to foreclosure, the bank will charge even higher rent to the next tenants. These conversations did not immediately solve everything, but they began to shift the dynamic. Several tenants expressed they had felt caught in the middle of a family dispute and were uncomfortable with the role they had been assigned in my parents' moral crusade. The most effective conversation turned out to be with Megan, one of the teacher roommates who had been quietly observing the conflict. After hearing my side fully, she confided that Jeff had been leading the rent strike in their house, pressuring her and Lisa to participate, even though they had concerns about the situation. Your brother came by last week, while Jeff was at work, Megan told me. He was strange. Talked about revolution and taking back housing from capitalists. Started looking through our kitchen cabinets without asking. Lisa and I felt really uncomfortable, but we did not know what to do. This information was invaluable. With Megan's permission, I set up a separate meeting with just her and Lisa, without Jeff present. They both expressed growing concerns about Daniel's erratic behavior and Jeff's increasingly radical stance. After a lengthy discussion, they agreed to resume paying rent directly to me and to provide written statements about Daniel's unauthorized entry and behavior in their home. With 2 of the 3 roommates back on board, Jeff's position became untenable. He could not cover the entire rent himself, and his revolutionary fervor dimmed considerably when faced with the practical reality of potentially losing his housing. On the community front, I decided to address my parents' social media campaign directly. I reached out to the administrator of the largest neighborhood Facebook group and requested the opportunity to respond to the allegations that had been shared. To my surprise, she was receptive, saying several members had expressed concern about the one-sided nature of the story being presented. I wrote a measured factual post, explaining the situation, providing documentation of my below-market rents and prompt maintenance record, and respectfully asking community members to consider whether they would want their own business practices judged based solely on the claims of estranged family members. The response was mixed but generally supportive. Several local landlords commented with messages of solidarity, sharing their own experiences with difficult family dynamics or tenant situations. A few neighbors who had interacted with me personally vouched for my character. While the public opinion had not completely turned, the conversation had become more nuanced, less a simple story of exploitation, and more a complex situation with multiple perspectives. The most difficult step was establishing firm boundaries with my family. After weeks of their interference, I realized that attempting to reason with them or appeal to their better nature had failed. They were committed to their course of action regardless of the harm it caused me or even the tenants they claimed to be helping. I drafted a final email to my parents copying my brother that laid out in clear terms what would happen if they continued their campaign against me. I outlined the legal actions I was prepared to take, including restraining orders and lawsuits for financial damages. I explained that while I had always respected their political views, their actions had crossed from ideology into illegal interference with my business and property rights. I am giving you one final opportunity to step back, I wrote. If you cease all contact with my tenants, immediately remove all social media posts about my properties, and Daniel vacates my property within 48 hours, I will not pursue legal action for what has already occurred. This is not a negotiation, and this is the only warning you will receive. My father responded with a lengthy email about the immorality of my ultimatum. My mother sent a shorter message expressing disappointment that I would threaten my own family. Daniel did not respond at all. The 48 hours passed with no change in their behavior. With a heavy heart, but absolute conviction, I instructed Catherine to proceed with all planned legal actions. The family relationship, as I had known it, was over, but I would protect what I had built regardless of the personal cost. 6 weeks after implementing our comprehensive legal strategy, I stood in a county courtroom watching as the judge delivered her ruling in the case of my second property where Daniel had physically installed himself. The evidence clearly shows Mr. Wallace is the sole legal owner of the property in question, the judge stated firmly. The document purporting to transfer ownership from the defendant's parents is fraudulent on its face, as they had no ownership interest to transfer. The court grants the plaintiff's request for an immediate injunction requiring Daniel Wallace to vacate the premises within 24 hours. She turned a stern gaze toward my brother, who had shown up to court in a wrinkled shirt, looking substantially less confident than he had when claiming my property. Furthermore, the court finds the defendant's actions constitute knowing and willful trespassing, fraud, and interference with legitimate business relationships. The plaintiff is entitled to recover damages, including legal fees and lost rental income. A hearing to determine the exact amount will be scheduled within 30 days. Daniel sat slumped in his chair, avoiding eye contact with me or the judge. My parents, who had declined to appear in court despite being subpoenaed, would face their own hearing for their role in the interference. That courtroom victory marked the beginning of the resolution phase. With a court order in hand, I met the sheriff's deputies at my second property the following day to oversee Daniel's removal. He had taken the night to clear out most of his belongings, but had left the bedroom in deplorable condition with food waste and damaged walls that would require significant repairs. Martha and George, who had witnessed the official removal, approached me cautiously afterward. "We are so sorry about all of this," Martha said, her eyes watery. "We should have trusted you from the beginning. Your brother was becoming increasingly erratic, making demands and threatening to evict us if we contacted you." I assured them I understood they had been put in an impossible position and that our rental relationship could continue if they wished to stay. They both expressed profound relief, and George handed me an envelope containing cashier's checks for the back rent they had withheld during the confusion. With the legal precedent established by the first case, the situations at my other properties resolved more quickly. The court granted similar injunctions, preventing my parents or brother from entering any of my properties or contacting my tenants. The fraudulent ownership claims were publicly refuted through court documents, helping restore clarity about who actually owned the properties. Most tenants returned to their normal payment schedules once the legal situation was clarified. Those who had been most influenced by my family's campaign, particularly Jeff, eventually moved out, allowing me to find new tenants who were not entangled in the conflict. The eviction processes I had begun were costly and time-consuming, but Catherine's expertise ensured they proceeded according to law, and ultimately they were effective in removing problem tenants. The financial recovery took longer than the legal resolution. 3 months of severely reduced rental income had created a significant hole in my finances. I had missed several mortgage payments across my properties and was receiving increasingly urgent notices from lenders. My credit score, once above 800, had plummeted to the low 600s. Catherine helped me file insurance claims for the property damage Daniel had caused during his occupation. While homeowners insurance typically would not cover damage by tenants, his status as an unlawful occupier meant the damage was categorized as vandalism, which was covered. The insurance payments helped fund the necessary repairs and partially offset my losses. To address the mortgage issues, I negotiated, with each lender providing court documentation, explaining the extraordinary circumstances, and offering payment plans to become current. 2 of the 3 lenders were reasonable, accepting my proposals with minimal additional fees. The third was more difficult, but eventually agreed to a loan modification that added the missed payments to the principal rather than requiring immediate payment. Rebuilding my emergency fund became a top priority. I temporarily took on additional accounting work on weekends and reduced all non-essential expenses. Every dollar of rental income beyond the mandatory mortgage tax and insurance payments went directly into savings. Within 6 months, I had accumulated enough to cover 3 months of expenses again, providing a small cushion of security. On the professional front, I was transparent with my employer about the resolution of the family conflict. The court rulings in my favor helped clarify that I had been the victim of interference rather than an exploitative landlord, and the negative attention gradually faded. My performance at work had remained strong despite the personal stress, which helped rebuild trust with colleagues and clients. The most complex aspect of recovery was addressing the family aftermath. My parents eventually received a court judgment requiring them to pay substantial damages for their interference with my business relationships. They initially refused to acknowledge the judgment, but when Catherine began the process of placing liens on their property, they reluctantly agreed to a payment plan. Our personal relationship, however, was beyond repair in the near term. In a brief, tense phone call after the final court ruling, my father maintained that they had acted according to their moral principles and felt no remorse. My mother suggested that someday I would understand they had been trying to help me become a better person by forcing me to confront the ethics of my choices. My brother was more severely impacted by the legal consequences. The fraud charges resulted in probation and community service, and the financial judgment against him was substantial. Unable to pay, he would have wages garnished from any legitimate employment for years to come. He sent a single email after the court proceedings, not to apologize, but to blame me for destroying his life, apparently, without irony, given his actions toward me. Setting boundaries with my family was painful but necessary for my well-being. I made it clear that any future relationship would require acknowledgement of the harm they had caused and respect for my right to make my own life choices, even when they disagreed with those choices. Until those conditions were met, I would maintain distance and legal protections. As the dust settled, I found myself reevaluating my approach to property ownership. The experience had not changed my belief that providing quality, fairly priced rental housing was a legitimate and valuable business, but it had shown me areas where I could improve. I developed a more comprehensive tenant screening process that included clear explanations of my management philosophy and expectations. I created more detailed lease agreements with specific clauses about property access and third-party interference. I implemented a secure online payment system that provided clear documentation of all transactions. These improvements not only protected me from potential future problems, but also provided more clarity and security for my tenants. I wanted rental relationships built on mutual understanding and respect, with transparency about the business aspects alongside the human connection. 6 months after the courtroom victory, an unexpected opportunity arose. A small apartment building in an adjacent neighborhood came on the market at a good price due to the owner's relocation. Despite the financial setback I had experienced, my bank was willing to finance the purchase based on my history with them and the court documentation explaining the temporary financial issues. This new acquisition represented not just financial growth, but also emotional victory. My family had tried to destroy what I had built, but instead I had emerged stronger, wiser, and with an expanding portfolio. The 4-unit building would provide homes for new tenants and additional income stability for me, a tangible symbol that adversity had not defeated me. As I received the keys to the new property, I felt a sense of closure on the darkest chapter of my professional life. The family who had raised me had betrayed me, but I had found the strength to stand up for myself and my principles. I had protected what I built and laid the foundation for future growth. The scars remained, but they had healed into something that made me more resilient rather than weaker. The year following the resolution of the legal battles was a period of profound personal healing and growth. The trauma of having my own family actively work to destroy my livelihood left deep emotional wounds that would not heal simply because the courts had ruled in my favor. I found myself struggling with trust issues that extended beyond my family to friendships and business relationships. On Catherine's recommendation, I began working with a therapist who specialized in family estrangement and betrayal trauma. Those weekly sessions provided a safe space to process the complex emotions I was experiencing: anger at the violation of trust, grief for the family relationships I had lost, and lingering anxiety about future betrayals. Through therapy, I came to understand that my parents' actions reflected their own rigid ideological beliefs rather than any true assessment of my character or business practices. This realization did not excuse their behavior, but it helped me see that their betrayal was not something I could have prevented through better actions or arguments on my part. The problem lay in their inability to separate their political views from their relationship with their son. As I worked through these personal issues, I also focused on building a stronger support network. The crisis had revealed who in my life was truly reliable. Alex, my oldest friend, who had talked me through my darkest moment in the parking lot, became an even more important presence in my life. I also found unexpected support from fellow landlords in my local real estate investment group, many of whom had faced their own family conflicts over property and money, if not quite as dramatically as mine. These new connections helped fill the void left by my estranged family. I began hosting monthly dinners at my home, creating a chosen family of friends who supported each other's goals and respected each other's life choices. These gatherings became a source of joy and stability, reminding me that meaningful connections could be built on mutual respect rather than obligatory blood ties. The experience transformed my understanding of boundaries in profound ways. I had always been somewhat conflict-averse, particularly with family, willing to tolerate disrespect and criticism to maintain peace. The painful lesson of the past year was that healthy relationships require firm boundaries, especially with people who have shown they will exploit closeness to cause harm. With my parents, I maintained the legal boundaries established during the court proceedings. They made several attempts to re-establish contact on their terms, including showing up unannounced at my home 6 months after the final court ruling. I remained firm in my requirement that any reconciliation would need to begin with acknowledgement of the harm they had caused and respect for my autonomy. So far, they had been unwilling to offer either. My brother took a different approach, alternating between angry accusations and claims of wanting to repair our relationship. When I insisted on the same boundaries I had established with our parents, he would quickly revert to hostility, revealing that his interest in reconciliation was superficial at best. I learned to disengage from these cyclical interactions, recognizing them as attempts to draw me back into unhealthy dynamics rather than genuine efforts to heal our relationship. This newfound clarity about boundaries extended to all areas of my life. At work, I became more assertive about my value and contributions, leading to a promotion and salary increase. With friends, I was more direct about my needs and expectations, creating deeper and more authentic connections. Even with tenants, I established clearer communication patterns and expectations, resulting in more professional and respectful relationships. My business practices evolved significantly in the aftermath of the crisis. The experience had forced me to become much more knowledgeable about property law, tenant rights, and the legal protections available to landlords. I now approached my rental business with greater professionalism and formal structure, while still maintaining the fair and responsive approach that had always been my goal. All new tenants now received a welcome packet that included not only practical information about their rental, but also a transparent overview of how rental income was used, from mortgage payments and property taxes to maintenance reserves and modest profit. This transparency helped establish from the beginning that I viewed the rental relationship as a fair exchange that benefited both parties. I implemented quarterly property inspections with detailed documentation, protecting both myself and my tenants by creating records of property conditions and addressing small maintenance issues before they became larger problems. I created a tenant portal where repair requests could be submitted, tracked, and documented, providing accountability and clarity for both sides. Perhaps most significantly, I began sharing my knowledge with other independent landlords who wanted to create fair and sustainable rental businesses. I spoke at several local real estate investment meetings about navigating family conflicts over property and developing tenant relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. This sharing of knowledge evolved into a side project, creating a resource guide for new landlords, emphasizing both the business fundamentals and the ethical dimensions of property ownership. The guide included sections on fair pricing strategies, effective communication with tenants, legal compliance, and maintaining appropriate boundaries with all stakeholders, including family members with different views on property ownership. Through all these changes and growth, I maintained my core belief that providing quality rental housing at fair prices was a valuable service that benefited both tenants and owners when done properly. Rather than allowing my family's attack to make me cynical or defensive, I had chosen to become a more informed, professional, and transparent property owner, a direct rebuke to their characterization of landlording as inherently exploitative. 1 year after the court victory, I hosted an open house at my newest property, the 4-unit building I had purchased during the recovery phase. The units had been thoughtfully renovated with energy-efficient appliances, updated bathrooms, and fresh paint throughout. The rents were set at 15% below market rate, continuing my commitment to fair pricing while ensuring the property remained financially sustainable. As I gave tours to prospective tenants, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and vindication. My parents had attempted to destroy what I had built, claiming moral authority for their actions. Instead, they had pushed me to create an even better version of my business model, one that more explicitly aligned with my values of fairness, transparency, and mutual benefit. Standing in the freshly renovated kitchen of the final unit, watching a young couple envision making it their home, I realized I had found a peace that transcended the pain of the past year. My family's betrayal had forced me to clarify what I truly believed about property business ethics and personal relationships. The result was not just survival, but transformation, a stronger, more authentic version of myself and my business. The journey had been painful beyond what I could have imagined, but I would not trade the wisdom it had brought me. I had learned that standing up for yourself is not selfish, but necessary, that healthy boundaries protect everyone involved, and that the family you choose can be more supportive than the family you are born into. Most importantly, I had learned that when faced with betrayal, the most powerful response is not bitterness, but building something better than what was attacked. So what about you? Have you ever had family members try to interfere with your business or career choices? How did you handle that situation? I would love to read your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to hear more real-life experiences, and share this with someone who might be struggling with family boundaries. Remember, sometimes the hardest battles we fight are with the people who should be supporting us the most, but those battles can make us stronger in ways we never expected. Thank you for listening to my story.